The sun had barely risen over the jagged cliffs and rolling beaches of Saipan on June 15th, 1944. Mist clung to the edges of the sugarcane fields, and the air was thick with the smell of salt, sweat, and gun oil. The island, small and unforgiving, seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the storm that would soon arrive. Japanese defenders, confident in the steel of their machines, polished and prodded their Type 97 Chiha medium tanks, the pride of the Imperial Japanese Army, each vehicle a symbol of their hope to halt the advancing Americans. These tanks, with their three-man crews and thin, angled armour, had once been feared across the Asian continent. Now, on this remote Pacific island, they were a final line of defence, and the men who tended them knew that their survival and the fate of Saipan depended on the performance of these machines. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Colonel Masaru Ishikawa, a wiry man of 42 who had once managed a tea plantation in Kyushu, strode along the tank line with an air of authority and quiet pride. His hands were calloused from years of work in the fields, yet they now traced the contours of the tanks as if drawing confidence from their cold steel. "These machines will hold the island," he said to his officers, his voice carrying across the morning haze. "The Americans will learn respect for the Emperor's will." The words were firm, resolute, yet underneath lay a fragile confidence born of desperation. He had trained his men to believe in the invincibility of their machines, but the distant boom of naval artillery reminded him that faith alone would not win a battle. The crews, young men barely out of adolescence, moved with a nervous energy along the line of tanks. Their faces were pale from lack of sleep, eyes wide with anticipation and fear. Each checked their 57mm guns, cleaned and oiled the thin armour plates, and muttered prayers under their breath. Sergeant Hiroshi Tanaka, aged 24, climbed into the turret of his Type 97, adjusting the sight and inspecting the ammunition. His fingers traced the cold metal of the gun, a small ritual that steadied his nerves. "If they come," he whispered, voice low and almost inaudible, "we will strike and retreat, like the wind through the palms." The phrase was a mantra, a desperate attempt to summon courage in the face of an enemy he had only seen in training exercises and intelligence reports. Even as the Japanese positioned their tanks behind hedgerows, in hidden gullies, and among coral outcroppings, unease settled over the crews. Saipan's terrain, though familiar to them, offered little in the way of protection from the armoured behemoths they were about to face. The Americans had not yet landed, but the sound of distant naval guns, heavy and relentless, boomed across the horizon, a drumbeat of inevitability. Sherman tanks, many with gleaming 75mm gun barrels, were moving into position on the beaches below. The men knew these machines were superior in armour, speed, and firepower, yet pride and duty bound them to their posts. Colonel Ishikawa paused at the edge of a coral outcrop, scanning the distant horizon through his binoculars. He counted the approaching silhouettes, noting the glint of metal in the early morning sun. "They are coming," he said softly, more to himself than anyone else. His voice carried over the breeze to Sergeant Tanaka, who nodded in acknowledgement. The men understood. This was no longer a drill, no longer a test of skill or courage. This was war, and the stakes could not be higher. The Type 97 Chiha, though outdated by Allied standards, had a history of clever design and battlefield cunning. Its low profile allowed it to maneuver through the dense undergrowth and coral ridges, while its diesel engine, a Mitsubishi V12, provided a top speed of nearly 24 miles per hour over flat terrain. Its main gun, originally 57mm, had been upgraded to a high-velocity 47mm model in the Shinhoto variant, yet even this could barely scratch the frontal armour of the Sherman. Its secondary weapons, one or two 7.7mm machine guns, were primarily intended for infantry support and offered little defence against modern tanks or American artillery. Despite these shortcomings, the crews had trained relentlessly, rehearsing flanking manoeuvres, ambushes, and hit-and-run tactics that might offset the Americans' superior firepower. By mid-morning, the distant sound of artillery grew louder. Smoke from naval bombardments drifted inland, twisting around palm trees and filling the air with the acrid scent of burning timber and torn earth. Japanese infantry scurried to reinforced positions, carrying ammunition, grenades, and rifles. Officers barked orders through the dust-choked air, organizing defensive lines and ensuring that the tanks were ready for the impending clash. Colonel Ishikawa moved among them, offering calm words, steadying hands, a presence meant to inspire confidence even as the enemy approached. He knew, deep down, that his men were brave, that they were skilled, but courage could not replace armor or firepower when facing an army that had perfected combined arms warfare. Sergeant Tanaka peered through the periscope of his turret, eyes narrowing as the first American vehicles appeared on the horizon. They moved in tight formations, steel hulks glinting under the sun, engines rumbling with mechanical authority. Each Sherman represented a challenge, a deadly question that the Type 97 seconds might not answer. He felt the familiar adrenaline surge, the pulse in his temples quickening as he gripped the controls. Around him, other crews whispered words of encouragement, exchanged brief nods, each man clinging to whatever fragments of hope remained. The island's geography, with its rolling plains and scattered coral ridges, offered some advantage, but it was limited. Flanking positions and natural cover allowed for ambushes, yet open fields left the tanks vulnerable to the Americans' long-range guns. Helicopters had yet to exist, but air reconnaissance planes hovered above, transmitting coordinates to artillery units below. The Japanese had dug foxholes and anti-tank ditches, yet these meager defences could only delay what seemed inevitable. Sergeant Tanaka's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the gun's elevation, aware that a single miscalculation could mean death. Colonel Ishikawa, sensing the anxiety among his men, raised his voice to address the gathered crews. "Remember," he said, "we fight for the island, for our families, for the honor of the Emperor. These machines are extensions of our will. Treat them as partners, as comrades, and they will carry you through the storm." His words hung in the humid air, mixing with the distant roar of naval guns and the low hum of engines. Some men nodded, hearts steadying. Others swallowed hard, the weight of what lay ahead pressing upon them. As the hours passed, the island seemed suspended in a strange limbo. Mist clung to the fields, rolling in slow waves, and the sun climbed higher, revealing the harsh reality of the terrain. Coral outcroppings jutted from the soil like jagged teeth, hiding ambush positions, while the tall sugarcane swayed gently in the breeze, masking movement but offering little real cover. The Type 97 seconds were lined up strategically, each assigned a sector, each crew knowing the approach of the Americans and the deadly potential of a frontal assault. The first encounters, when they occurred, were brief and violent. Japanese gunners fired their main guns, shells thudding against sandbags and trees, while Sherman rounds tore through thin armor with devastating effect. The clash of steel, the roar of engines, and the screams of men and machines filled the air. Sergeant Tanaka fired again, the recoil jarring his shoulder, as another Type 97 fell in flames just meters from his position. Panic and courage intertwined in the hearts of the crews, each man aware that survival was as much about luck as skill. Hours stretched into a tense, deadly day. The Type 97 seconds moved where they could, attempting to flank, attempting to use the terrain to their advantage, yet each maneuver was met by superior firepower, coordinated infantry, and relentless American tactics. Colonel Ishikawa watched from his observation point, noting every loss, every retreat, every heroic but futile action. He understood the mathematics of warfare, the cruel calculus that bravery alone could not overcome. Yet he refused to abandon his men, refusing to leave the line unobserved, as if his presence alone could make a difference. By late afternoon, the battle had become a brutal test of endurance. Smoke hung thick over the fields, carrying the acrid scent of burning fuel, scorched metal, and gunpowder. Crews moved with grim determination, shouting orders, adjusting positions, and attempting to rally morale. Sergeant Tanaka, exhausted but unyielding, guided his tank through shallow gullies, avoiding direct lines of fire, always searching for a position that might offer a chance to strike back at the relentless Shermans. He understood, however, that each successful maneuver was temporary, that every engagement brought them closer to the inevitable. As evening fell, the island seemed to exhale a collective sigh. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the shattered landscape. Fires burned in the distance, lighting the twisted forms of destroyed tanks and the figures of men who had fought to the last breath. The Type 97 seconds, once symbols of Japanese might, were reduced to silhouettes against the orange sky, reminders of valor and futility entwined. Colonel Ishikawa moved among the surviving crews, offering what comfort he could, knowing that night would bring little relief. The Americans would not rest, and the fight for Saipan was far from over. In the fading light, Sergeant Tanaka climbed out of his turret, surveying the wreckage and the horizon beyond. He thought of home, of Kyushu's rolling fields, of the lives he might never return to. He thought of the Emperor, of honor, and of the impossible task before them. His hands rested on the cold steel of his tank, a lifeline in a world that had become chaotic and lethal. Somewhere in the distance, the first Sherman fired again, a bright flash cutting through the dusk, and Tanaka knew that tomorrow would bring the same relentless struggle, the same deadly dance of metal and courage. The island held its breath through the night, a silence punctuated only by distant gunfire and the occasional crackle of fires. The Type 97 seconds, scarred, tired, but still standing where they could, waited for the inevitable next wave. The men inside whispered prayers, told stories of past glories, and steeled themselves for what was to come. Colonel Ishikawa, gazing across the horizon, understood that the fate of Saipan, and perhaps of the Pacific War, would be decided not just by steel and firepower, but by courage, strategy, and the unforgiving march of history. And so the island waited, poised between dawn and darkness, as men and machines readied themselves for the battle that would become legend, the clash of Japanese Type 97 seconds against the relentless tide of American Sherman tanks. Every heart beat faster, every finger tightened on a trigger, every eye strained toward the horizon, knowing that in the hours to come, bravery alone would be tested against fire, steel, and fate itself. Saipan held its breath, and the world watched as history prepared to be written in smoke and flame. By mid-morning, the roar of American amphibious vehicles shattered the fragile calm of Saipan's beaches. The U.S. Marines stormed ashore with precision, their landing crafts grinding against the sand, engines screaming, and treads carving through the surf. The sky above hummed with the whine of aircraft, P-38 Lightnings and F-4U Corsairs streaking across the horizon, strafing entrenched Japanese positions with lethal intent. Mortars thudded into hedgerows and coral ridges, sending earth, smoke, and splintered timber flying in every direction. The once proud lines of Japanese defences, carefully placed over months of preparation, became chaos incarnate, smouldering under relentless bombardment. Yet in the midst of this inferno, the Type 97 Chi-Ha medium tanks rumbled to life, their engines sputtering and coughing as though aware of the impossible task ahead. Sergeant Hiroshi Tanaka, aged 24, gripped the controls of his Type 97, sweat streaking down his face and mixing with the dust and grime of the battlefield. The tall grass around him whipped against the hull as he maneuvered through uneven terrain, each bump and jolt sending vibrations through the thin metal frame. "Steady, steady," he muttered, more to himself than to his crew. He could see the first American tanks appearing across the fields, silhouettes gleaming in the morning sun. Each Sherman was a monstrous shape of steel and promise, its 75mm gun barrel gleaming with quiet menace. The sight made the blood in his veins run cold, yet he forced his hands to remain steady. The Type 97's main gun roared once, a low-caliber shell thudding against sandbags and palm trees with a hollow impact that echoed across the battlefield. The shell skittered off the Sherman's thick frontal armor, leaving only a small dent, a futile reminder of the tank's limitations. Tanaka's heart pounded. He knew that the Type 97 had once dominated battlefields in China, where its agility and clever design had allowed Japanese crews to ambush and overwhelm less advanced armoured vehicles. Those victories, however, felt distant now, a fading memory in the face of the Shermans' superior speed, armour, and firepower. Another Type 97 beside Tanaka fired its main gun, a flash of smoke erupting from its turret. For a moment, it seemed as if the tanks might hold their ground, yet the American response was immediate. One Sherman, moving with calculated precision, returned fire. Its shell struck the Japanese tank dead center. The armor splintered and screamed, a shower of sparks and twisted metal erupting outward. The explosion sent a heatwave into Tanaka's cabin, singeing his face and scorching the inside of the turret. He barely had time to shout, "Fall back!" before witnessing the second Type 97 disintegrate in a fiery plume, flames licking the steel and painting the battlefield orange. The sound of burning fuel, twisted metal, and human screams blended into a single, terrifying symphony. Despite the bravery and skill of the Japanese crews, the disparity in firepower was undeniable. Tanaka's tank, agile and low to the ground, could only dodge and weave for so long before the Shermans' combined firepower began to tell. Their 75mm rounds could penetrate the Type 97's thin armour with chilling ease, while the Japanese 57mm guns struggled to even mark the American hulls. Each manoeuvre, each desperate attempt to flank or ambush, was met with counterfire that seemed almost preordained, the Americans moving as though the battlefield were a chessboard and the Japanese tanks mere pawns. Tanaka felt the tension coiling in his shoulders, a tightness that threatened to paralyze him. Around him, other Type 97 seconds attempted to form a cohesive line, but coordination was impossible under the barrage. The hedgerows that had once promised cover now offered little protection. Mortars from the shore struck at random, hurling chunks of earth and steel into the air, while the Shermans rolled forward with methodical precision. The Japanese tank crews, though determined, were fighting against a tide of firepower that exceeded their imagination, their training, and the capabilities of their machines. The battlefield became a surreal landscape of smoke, fire, and the metallic scent of burning steel. Trees were splintered, coconut palms snapped like twigs, and the air vibrated with the thunder of artillery and tank shells. Tanaka fired again, the recoil jarring his shoulder, and watched as his round ricocheted harmlessly off a Sherman's frontal plate. He cursed under his breath, realizing that brute force alone would not suffice. Each shell expended brought him closer to emptiness, each movement a gamble between survival and destruction. A Sherman advanced from the ridge, its treads churning up the sodden earth, leaving deep gouges in the battlefield. Tanaka's crew attempted to outmaneuver it, skirting along a shallow gully, but the enemy tank adjusted with ease, anticipating their moves. The American gunners fired in disciplined sequences, each shot a calculated attempt to disable the Japanese armour. One round hit a Type 97 inches the rear, and the explosion sent the vehicle flipping into a shallow ditch. The driver and gunner were thrown clear, their screams mingling with the roar of engines and the whine of strafing aircraft. Tanaka swallowed the lump in his throat, the reality of death pressing close. Amid the chaos, Tanaka saw the faces of his fellow crewmen, young men of 18, 19, barely men yet forced into a battle that would define or end their lives. They moved with trembling hands, shouting commands, and doing everything possible to keep their tanks operational. Each Type 97 was both machine and shield, a fragile vessel carrying human courage against overwhelming odds. Tanaka knew that for every Sherman disabled, at least one Type 97 would fall in return. It was a cycle of attrition, brutal and merciless, dictated by firepower, terrain, and sheer chance. The air above was filled with the screech of American aircraft diving for strafing runs. Tracer bullets streaked across the sky, cutting through smoke and dust in brief arcs of deadly light. Tanaka ducked instinctively as the turret hatch rattled from the near miss of a machine gun round. The cockpit was suffused with acrid smoke, and visibility was almost nil. He could only rely on the sound of engines, the vibration of metal beneath him, and the instinct honed from months of preparation. Every decision was life or death, every maneuver a test of resolve. As the battle raged, the Japanese tanks began to splinter their formations, seeking cover in gullies and behind rocks. Coordination broke down entirely, leaving individual crews to fend for themselves. Tanaka realized that the Shermans' superior speed allowed them to encircle, outflank, and isolate each Type 97 with surgical efficiency. Communication among the Japanese was nearly impossible. Radios, overwhelmed by static and gunfire. Orders shouted across the battlefield were drowned in explosions and the roar of engines, leaving men to act on instinct, fear, and training. A Sherman fired at close range, hitting a Type 97 inches the side. The metal groaned under the impact, and the tank lurched violently, sending Tanaka sprawling against the controls. Sparks flew, smoke filled the interior, and the acrid smell of burning insulation stung his eyes and lungs. He coughed, wiping soot from his face, knowing that if the crew did not retreat, they would join the ranks of the fallen. Around him, fires erupted, black plumes marking the death of tanks, men, and hope in equal measure. Despite the terror, Tanaka's crew persevered. They fired when they could, maneuvered when possible, and prayed that luck would grant them the mercy of survival. Each Sherman, disabled or damaged, offered a fleeting sense of triumph, yet the losses were mounting, the weight of hopelessness pressing ever closer. The Japanese tank doctrine, based on ambushes and mobility, faltered against the Americans' coordinated armor, artillery, and air support. The battlefield was a machine of destruction, relentless and indifferent, and Tanaka understood that courage alone could not overcome steel and firepower so superior. By afternoon, the once formidable hedgerows and defensive positions were transformed into a landscape of twisted metal and smoke. The Type 97 seconds that remained were scattered, some attempting to regroup, others immobilized by damage, and some burning where they fell. Tanaka's own tank had narrowly avoided a direct hit, but the crew was battered, nerves frayed, and ammunition dangerously low. He realized that the tide of the battle was not merely turning but had already swept over the defenders, leaving them clinging to survival. Through the smoke and chaos, Tanaka caught sight of Colonel Ishikawa, moving among the wreckage, shouting encouragement, and trying to rally what remained of the tank crews. The sight offered a brief flicker of hope, a reminder that leadership could still matter in the maelstrom. Yet even as the colonel raised his voice, a Sherman rolled past, guns blazing, scattering the survivors and sending columns of smoke spiraling into the sky. The battlefield was a theater of destruction, every action measured in seconds, every decision weighted with life or death. As the sun climbed higher, Tanaka and his crew continued their desperate dance across the battlefield, maneuvering through scorched earth and shattered vegetation, dodging shell fire, and attempting to strike back when opportunities arose. The roar of engines, the thunder of artillery, and the screams of the dying were constant companions, marking the rhythm of survival. For every Sherman disabled, a Type 97 was lost, the numbers overwhelmingly in favor of the Americans. Tanaka felt the weight of inevitability pressing down, yet he fought on, driven by duty, honor, and the faint hope that, somehow, they might survive the first wave. Nightfall approached, casting long shadows over the battlefield. Fires burned uncontrolled, illuminating the devastation in stark reds and oranges. Tanaka finally brought his tank to a stop in a shallow gully, the crew exhausted, trembling, and silent. They had survived the first wave, but at a cost that was immediately apparent. Wrecked Type 97 seconds littered the landscape, flames licking at the twisted metal, and the cries of the wounded echoed across the fields. Tanaka closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the vibration of the dying engine beneath him, and whispered a prayer for his fallen comrades, for those who would not see another day, and for the impossible task still ahead. The first wave had proven what the crews had feared. The Americans were relentless, their tanks superior, and their strategy deadly. The Type 97 seconds had fought with courage and skill, but the price of bravery had been staggering. Tanaka knew that survival in the hours to come would demand every ounce of ingenuity, resilience, and fortune. The battlefield, still smoking and chaotic, awaited the next chapter of carnage, and the men of Saipan braced themselves for what history would record as a clash between courage and overwhelming power, the first wave only a prelude to the relentless onslaught that would define the island's fate. Night fell over Saipan like a velvet curtain, the moonlight faint and fragmented behind drifting clouds. The island seemed eerily calm, a deceptive stillness that stretched across the coral cliffs and sugarcane fields. Colonel Masaru Ishikawa, aged 42, stood atop a rocky ridge near Mount Tapashao, peering down at the darkened valleys below. His hand rested on the binoculars, scanning the faint outlines of his assembled armoured force. 31 Type 97 Chiha medium tanks had been gathered, a rare concentration for the Imperial Japanese Army on this island. The colonel's chest swelled with a mixture of pride and trepidation. "Tonight," he said, his voice sharp in the night air, "we will strike. The Americans do not yet know this land as we do. They underestimate us. We will ambush them, destroy their pride, and reclaim the honor of the Emperor. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." The men around him, young tank commanders and crewmen barely out of adolescence, nodded silently. Some were 19, some 20, a few just entering their 21st year. They polished their armor and rifles one last time, checking ammunition, inspecting engines, and whispering quiet prayers. Sergeant Hiroshi Tanaka, his face smeared with soot and sweat from the earlier battles, crouched by the hatch of his tank, adjusting the turret and whispering to the crew. "Steady," he said, though his own hands trembled. "If we move together, we can surprise them. If we fail—" His voice faltered, swallowed by the night. The shadow of impending disaster hung over them, unspoken but undeniable. Unknown to Ishikawa and his men, the Americans had not been idle. Using intelligence gathered from scouts, intercepted communications, and careful observation of Japanese patrols, the U.S. forces had anticipated this very counterattack. Lieutenant James Caldwell, a young Sherman commander of 27, crouched behind a ridge some 3 kilometers away. His eyes scanned the darkness through binoculars, and he spotted the 31 Type 97 seconds slowly advancing into what appeared to be a perfect flanking route. Caldwell's lips curved into a grin. "They're walking right into our line," he whispered into the radio. His voice was calm, almost casual, belying the tension that simmered beneath the surface. "All units, fire on my mark." The American tanks and infantry had spent the day preparing. Artillery positions were camouflaged behind coconut palms, machine gun nests concealed among the rocky outcroppings, and anti-tank teams had lined the clearing with precise fields of fire. Each Sherman knew its role, each crew drilled for this exact scenario. Caldwell's plan was simple, ruthless in its effectiveness. Lure the Japanese armor into the trap, use combined arms to disable as many tanks as possible, and prevent a retreat. As the Japanese columns moved forward, engines rattling softly in the night, the illusion of safety made each crewman tense with anticipation. The Type 97 seconds moved in formation, their thin armor glinting faintly in the dim light. They had once ruled in China, dominating smaller, weaker armored forces, and each crewman believed that discipline, coordination, and knowledge of the terrain could tip the scales. They imagined the Shermans as distant silhouettes, unaware of the ambush about to unfold. At precisely 11 o'clock, Caldwell's voice crackled over the radio. "Now." The first shells struck with terrifying precision. Explosions tore through the darkness, fire and metal raining into the night sky. A Type 97 near the front of the column erupted in a ball of flame, its turret blown skyward like a twisted toy. The next tank tried to reverse, but the Americans were ready. Machine gun fire cut across the open field, shredding any movement and pinning crews inside their burning machines. The remaining tanks attempted to maneuver, spinning in circles to avoid incoming rounds, but the 75mm shells penetrated thin armor with terrifying ease. Every explosion sent shockwaves through the ground, rattling nearby vehicles and throwing crewmen to the floorboards of their cramped turrets. Tanaka's Type 97 jolted as a shell struck the side, sending a shudder through the frame. Smoke and sparks filled the interior, choking the air with the stench of scorched metal and burning fuel. He shouted instructions to the crew, but the din of battle swallowed words before they could reach ears. Outside, the night erupted in a symphony of destruction. Flames licked the sky as one tank after another erupted in fire. Shadows of the destroyed vehicles danced across the clearing, 31 in total, each a testament to the overwhelming firepower of the Americans. The Japanese crews fought with desperation, trying to turn, flank, or hide behind the uneven terrain. Some attempted to retreat down narrow gullies, only to find themselves cut off by American infantry or trapped by artillery fire. One Type 97 spun out of control, rolling down a rocky slope, the crew inside flailing as metal crumpled around them. Another tank's engine stalled under the impact of shrapnel, leaving it an immobile target for a Sherman to finish off with a direct hit. The air was thick with smoke, acrid and suffocating, mingling with the scent of burning oil and scorched earth. The night was punctuated by the screams of the dying and the metallic groans of twisting steel. Each Type 97 destroyed echoed across the valley, a stark reminder of the Japanese armor's inferiority in the face of the American advance. The Shermans moved forward relentlessly, their treads crushing shrubs and earth alike, unstoppable and methodical. Caldwell's command was efficient, his voice over the radio directing artillery, coordinating flanking maneuvers, and ensuring that no Japanese tank could escape. The trap had worked with terrifying efficiency. Colonel Ishikawa, standing atop the ridge, watched his armoured force annihilated before his eyes. His normally sharp face was pale, lips pressed tightly together as firelight reflected in his eyes. 31 tanks, each one a piece of carefully cultivated pride, destroyed in a single night. The island, which had seemed calm under the cover of darkness, was now alive with the chaos of burning steel, shouting men, and the distant boom of naval artillery. His heart pounded as he tried to comprehend the scale of the loss. His strategies, his training, and his belief in the invincibility of his forces had crumbled in hours. Tanaka, still inside his smoking Type 97, glanced at the remaining vehicles. Only a handful had survived, scattered across the field, engines smoking, armor shredded. Some crews had abandoned their tanks, running across the open ground under the cover of night, dodging machine gun fire, grenades, and artillery shells. Others were trapped, the hatches jammed by debris, forced to wait for death to come from the relentless Americans above and around them. He pressed his forehead against the cool metal of the turret, the vibrations of the engine the only thing keeping him tethered to life. As the hours wore on, the field became a graveyard of fire and steel. The silhouettes of destroyed Type 97 seconds cast long, flickering shadows under the moonlight. Flames danced across twisted turrets, and the occasional blast of gunfire shattered the uneasy quiet that followed the initial bombardment. The night air was heavy with the scent of oil, burning rubber, and gunpowder. Tanaka's ears rang from the constant detonations, each explosion a violent punctuation mark against the whispers of wind and the cries of wounded men. The Americans did not relent. Sherman after Sherman rolled forward, coordinating their movements with infantry squads and artillery positions. Caldwell's orders ensured that any tank attempting to escape would meet a deadly response. Machine guns cut down crewmen fleeing across open ground, and artillery shells were timed to explode just behind the retreating vehicles, blocking their paths and sowing confusion. Each Type 97 that fell reinforced the sense of inevitability, a grim realization that night was not an ally but a silent witness to devastation. Tanaka's crew, battered and exhausted, continued to fire whenever possible, though the effectiveness of their weapons was minimal. Every round expended was a desperate attempt to keep the Americans at bay, but each strike only delayed the inevitable. The Sherman's superior armor, firepower, and coordination rendered the Japanese tanks almost ceremonial sacrifices, courageous yet doomed in the face of technological superiority. The clash of steel, the screams of men, and the roar of engines created an atmosphere of nightmarish intensity, a tableau of war that would linger in memory long after the battle ended. By midnight, the clearing had transformed into a scene of utter destruction. 31 Type 97 seconds, once the pride of Japanese armor, lay destroyed. Some were engulfed in flames, others tilted at impossible angles, turret guns pointing skyward in eerie silence. The few survivors huddled in the shadows, trembling and exhausted, aware that the battle was lost. The Americans had anticipated every move, countered every strategy, and exploited the weaknesses of the Japanese tanks with surgical precision. It was not merely a defeat, it was a demonstration of overwhelming force, coordination, and superior technology. Colonel Ishikawa finally turned away from the devastation, his face drawn and pale under the firelight. The pride he had invested in his tanks, the confidence in their ability to hold the island, had been shattered. The field of destroyed Type 97 seconds stretched below him like a blackened scar across the landscape. His men, the young crewmen who had trusted his orders and the might of their machines, were scattered, some dead, some wounded, and some fleeing into the darkness. The night had claimed the pride of the Imperial Japanese Army on Saipan in a single, merciless stroke. Tanaka, leaning against the charred remains of his turret, finally allowed himself to breathe, the adrenaline leaving him in waves that shook his body. He could hear the distant voices of American infantry moving cautiously through the island, the metallic clatter of Sherman tracks on broken earth, and the faint whine of aircraft patrolling overhead. The survivors understood the reality. Their armoured core had been annihilated, their counterattack crushed before it could even gain momentum, and the island was slipping further from Japanese control. By the first light of dawn, the clearing was quiet except for smouldering fires and the distant groans of wounded men. 31 Type 97 seconds had fallen in a single night, a number that would echo in the memories of both the survivors and the Americans who had witnessed the destruction. Caldwell's line had held, the ambush executed with flawless precision, and the island itself bore the marks of what would later be called the greatest armoured defeat for the Japanese in the Pacific Campaign. For the men of Saipan, the night would live forever in memory, the metallic screams of twisted steel, the acrid stench of fire, the sense of powerlessness against an enemy who anticipated every move. Tanaka, despite exhaustion and grief, understood that survival alone was a small victory. The cost had been unimaginable, the force annihilated, but at least some had lived to fight another day. Ishikawa's pride, like the tanks, had been consumed by fire and smoke, a shadow of what it once promised. As the sun rose on June 16, 1944, the island appeared calm again. From the ridge, Tanaka could see smoke curling into the sky, each column a monument to the 31 shadows that had fallen. The battlefield was littered with wreckage, and the few remaining Japanese tanks were scattered and disorganized. The Americans were advancing, cautious yet relentless, and the myth of the Type 97's dominance had been irrevocably broken. Saipan had changed hands in spirit, even if the battle was not yet fully decided, and the night's carnage would remain a testament to the cost of underestimating both men and machines. 31 shadows lay across Saipan's fields, their silhouettes burned into memory, each a story of courage, fear, and the deadly efficiency of a well-prepared enemy. Tanaka and the surviving crews would carry the skending weight of this night forever, haunted by the roar of shells, the flicker of flames, and the knowledge that bravery alone could not overcome superior firepower. The Americans had proven the Sherman to be a weapon of decisive force, and the Type 97, for all its history and pride, was finally revealed for what it was: vulnerable, outmatched, and no match for the future of armoured warfare. Dawn crept over the horizon on June 16, 1944, painting the jagged cliffs and beaches of Saipan with pale gold light. Mist still clung to the sugarcane fields, and the air smelled of salt, smoke, and scorched metal. The battlefield, which had been alive with fire, shouts, and the roar of engines the night before, was now eerily silent. The 31 Type 97 Chi-Ha medium tanks, once the pride of the Imperial Japanese Army, lay in twisted heaps across the open fields near Mount Tapashao. Smoke spiraled from ruptured turrets, the thin armor of the vehicles torn and blackened, their engines silent forever. The thunder of American 75mm shells had ended, leaving only the whisper of the wind through shattered palm fronds and the distant calls of birds returning to the ruined landscape. Sergeant Hiroshi Tanaka, aged 23, survived the carnage. Crawling from the wreckage of his Type 97, he emerged covered in soot, oil, and blood from minor burns and scratches. His limbs ached with exhaustion, his muscles trembling with the tension of survival. He paused, peering across the battlefield, stomach churning at the sight of mangled steel and fallen comrades. Some friends he had trained with, laughed with, and shared stories of home with now lay dead, their uniforms blackened and faces unrecognizable. Others were wounded, crawling, limping, or attempting to drag themselves into the scant cover offered by coral ridges, tunnels, or makeshift foxholes. The island that they had believed would be an unbreachable fortress had become, instead, a graveyard of pride, courage, and miscalculation. Tanaka moved cautiously, avoiding splintered metal and burning debris. Every step was measured, a dance between urgency and survival. The cries of the wounded echoed faintly in the distance, some pleading for water, others for aid, most receiving none. The Type 97 had been designed for mobility and speed, meant to outmaneuver enemies on narrow plains and forested hills. It had seen victories in China and Southeast Asia, and in the minds of its crews, it was invincible. But against the American Sherman, with its 75mm main gun, superior armor, and coordinated infantry support, that illusion had vanished in one catastrophic night. The realization weighed heavily on Tanaka. Skill, courage, and discipline could not compensate for technological inferiority. Across the battlefield, Lieutenant James Caldwell, aged 27, surveyed the destruction from the safety of his Sherman's turret. He had remained in position throughout the night, coordinating movements, directing artillery fire, and ensuring the trap worked with brutal efficiency. 31 Japanese Type 97 seconds had entered the clearing, each believing in their ability to flank and strike a decisive blow. Within hours, every single tank had been destroyed. Caldwell's voice, quiet and soft as he spoke into the radio, carried a mixture of awe, relief, and sorrow. 31, he said almost to himself, his eyes sweeping over the blackened wrecks and smouldering turrets. 31 tanks, gone in one night. The calm that settled over the battlefield was deceptive. Though the armoured threat had been neutralised, the Japanese infantry remained, scattered across the island in caves, tunnels, and behind coral ridges. Demoralised and leaderless, they had lost the coordinated support that the Type 97 seconds had provided. Their morale, once reinforced by pride in their armoured corps, was fractured. The soldiers who had emerged from the night before with fire in their eyes were now hesitant, uncertain where to regroup, whether to fight, or to attempt a perilous retreat toward the rugged interior. Some units had fled into the mountains, seeking temporary refuge. Others had surrendered to small pockets of American infantry who cautiously moved through the fields, aware that even a defeated enemy could strike with desperate ferocity. Tanaka crawled through the tall grass, moving past burning hulks of Japanese tanks, hearing the occasional hiss or explosion as a remnant of fuel or ammunition ignited. Each tank seemed to tell a story. The Type 97's thin armor, designed for speed rather than endurance, had failed to withstand concentrated fire. The 75mm rounds from Shermans had penetrated at will. Machine guns and supporting infantry had made maneuver impossible. The destruction was both total and precise, a testament to the Americans' preparation and tactical understanding. For Tanaka, it was a bitter confirmation of a lesson he would never forget. Bravery alone could not overcome firepower. Training alone could not deflect technological advantage. The surviving Japanese soldiers, now disorganized and scattered, struggled to find cohesion. The island's natural features, steep ridges, coral cliffs, and dense sugarcane, offered some cover, but could not restore the structural advantage the Type 97 seconds had once provided. Colonel Ishikawa, aged 42, had vanished into a nearby cave system with a handful of aides. His chest, normally full of pride, now weighed heavy with despair. The strategies he had planned, the formations he had drilled, and the confidence in the Emperor's armor had all collapsed under the relentless American assault. 31 tanks, symbols of strength and invincibility, annihilated in one night, had shattered not only the Japanese defenses but also the morale of every infantryman who had relied on them. Meanwhile, Caldwell continued to coordinate the American advance. He observed as engineers and infantry moved carefully into positions formerly dominated by Japanese tanks. The destroyed vehicles provided both obstacles and protection. Some Sherman crews used the wreckage for cover as they cleared pockets of enemy resistance. Artillery crews fired sporadically, targeting caves, ridges, and known escape routes, ensuring that no enemy regrouped or counterattacked. The Americans understood that control of the armored battlefield meant more than just the destruction of machines. It symbolized the collapse of Japanese command and coordination across Saipan. Tanaka, breathing heavily, finally reached a small rise overlooking the battlefield. He looked back over the carnage. 31 twisted hulks of Type 97 seconds, smoke still curling lazily from the turrets, scorched earth beneath their treads, and the occasional flicker of flame from burning fuel. The silence, punctuated only by distant American shouts and artillery, was almost more haunting than the previous night's chaos. Survivors moved through the wreckage, some tending to the wounded, others attempting to salvage weapons, maps, or anything of value. The scene was one of defeat, of pride consumed, and of the harsh reality of modern armored warfare. In the distance, the sound of American aircraft could be heard patrolling the island, reconnaissance planes scanning for remaining Japanese positions. Air superiority had compounded the Japanese difficulties, preventing any organized movement during the night. The Type 97 seconds, though nimble, had been visible against the moonlight and open terrain, and the Americans had exploited that exposure fully. Anti-tank teams had predicted every maneuver, artillery had been pre-sighted, and Sherman gunners had executed with ruthless precision. For the Japanese, the combination of technology, planning, and overwhelming firepower had been impossible to overcome. Tanaka's thoughts drifted to his comrades, those who had not survived. Young men barely into their 20s, full of hope and the illusion of invincibility, now lay in twisted metal or scattered across the fields. Victims of circumstance and strategic miscalculation. He remembered their laughter, their youthful bravado, the way they had spoken of home, of family, of rice fields and fishing boats far away. All of that was gone now, replaced by smoke, ash, and the acrid scent of burning machinery. The weight of survival pressed heavily on him, a burden of guilt and sorrow for those who could not escape the night. Lieutenant Caldwell, standing atop his Sherman, observed the American infantry cautiously moving forward. The battlefield had been cleared, but the Americans knew that even defeated soldiers could resist fiercely if cornered. The 31 Type 97 seconds had been destroyed, but pockets of Japanese infantry remained entrenched, desperate and dangerous. Engineers moved toward the airfields, assessing damage and preparing for repairs, while Sherman crews readied for the next, the phase of the battle, securing the island fully and preparing for operations that would extend toward the Japanese homeland. The significance of Saipan's capture was clear. Controlling the island meant launching air raids, cutting supply lines, and pressuring the Empire's defensive network. Tanaka crawled through a small ravine, finally pausing beside a coral ridge. His uniform was torn, streaked with soot and blood, his hands raw from dragging himself over rocks and through debris. He looked back one last time at the field of wrecked Type 97 seconds. 31 shadows of what had once been prideful symbols of Japanese armoured might now lay broken and lifeless. The memory of the shells, the screams, and the fires would linger forever. The lesson was indelible. The battlefield had changed, and the age of the Type 97's dominance was over. As the sun rose higher, illuminating the island in full, the scale of the destruction became even more apparent. The fields were littered with splintered turrets, severed treads, and blackened engines. Smoke rose in thin plumes from scattered fires, carrying with it the acrid smell of destruction. American engineers moved quickly, marking the destroyed vehicles, clearing paths, and preparing to consolidate control over the island. Infantrymen, cautious but confident, moved into positions formerly defended by Japanese armor, encountering little organized resistance. The psychological impact of 31 tanks destroyed in one night was profound, sending a clear message to both sides. American firepower was decisive, coordinated, and unrelenting. By late morning, the surviving Japanese forces had begun retreating into the island's interior, some toward the mountains, others into cave networks. The absence of armored support left them vulnerable, their morale shattered and their command fractured. Colonel Ishikawa's plans were in ruins, his authority undermined, and his once proud men scattered. Sergeant Tanaka, exhausted and battered, recognized the reality of defeat. The battlefield was a testament not only to technological superiority, but also to the consequences of overconfidence and underestimation of an adaptive, prepared enemy. In the midst of the ruin, Tanaka paused, looking at the horizon where the ocean met the sky. The distant hum of American naval artillery and the soft roar of aircraft reminded him that the battle was not over, but the era of the Type 97 Chiha on Saipan was finished. 31 tanks, lost in a single night, had been the fulcrum upon which the balance of the island tipped. The survivors would carry this memory, a haunting reminder of courage, desperation, and the unforgiving calculus of modern war. Lieutenant Caldwell, observing the final movements of Japanese forces, allowed himself a moment of reflection. He thought of the crews, the young men who had trusted their machines and training, and the precision required to execute the ambush so decisively. 31 tanks, destroyed in one night, was more than a statistic. It was a turning point, a moment where the future of the Pacific campaign was irrevocably altered. The airfields once defended by these tanks were now within reach, opening the way for U.S. engineers, air support, and subsequent operations that would extend pressure directly onto the Japanese home islands. Sergeant Tanaka, finally reaching a hidden ravine behind the battlefield, collapsed against a rock. His breaths came in ragged gasps, his body trembling from exhaustion and the trauma of survival. The night of fire, the roar of shells, and the metallic screams of 31 Type 97 seconds destroyed replayed in his mind in relentless cycles. He closed his eyes briefly, whispering a prayer for his fallen comrades, a prayer for himself, and a prayer for the island that had become both a battlefield and a tomb. By the time the sun reached its zenith, Saipan had been irrevocably changed. 31 shadows of Japanese armor lay across its two fields, their destruction marking both the fall of an army's pride and the assertion of American dominance. The few surviving Japanese soldiers, including Tanaka, had no choice but to retreat, to regroup, and to contemplate the devastation that had unfolded. The lessons of firepower, preparation, and adaptability were etched into the scorched earth and twisted steel of the battlefield. The fall of Saipan's armor was complete. 31 Type 97 Chiha medium tanks had been destroyed in one night, leaving only scorched wrecks and scattered survivors. The island was no longer a symbol of Japanese invincibility. It was now a gateway for American forces, a strategic foothold from which the Pacific campaign would continue, and a stark reminder that technology, preparation, and coordination could outweigh even the most determined resistance. Sergeant Tanaka, standing among the remnants of his fallen comrades, understood this truth with a clarity that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The field of 31 shadows would remain etched in memory, a testament to bravery, failure, and the relentless advance of war. In the weeks following the battle, the bodies of the Type 97 crews were buried hastily by surviving Japanese soldiers, their faces etched with exhaustion and grief. Sergeant Hiroshi Tanaka, aged 23, moved carefully among the wreckage, marking the graves of his fallen friends with scraps of metal, splintered wood, and bits of canvas. He knelt beside each grave, tracing the twisted edges of the destroyed tanks, recalling the roar of engines, the acrid smell of diesel and smoke, the screams that had pierced the night, and the relentless crack of gunfire. Each memory weighed heavily, pressing into him the cost of pride and the fragility of life in modern war. His thoughts drifted to his home in Kyushu, to the quiet tea fields and the small village where life had once been simple, unbroken by conflict. That life, he knew, would never return. Saipan, scarred and blackened, carried now the memory of 31 Type 97 tanks destroyed and the men who had ridden them. It had become a silent testament to the lethal calculus of armoured warfare and the unforgiving nature of World War II. Across the Pacific, American forces pressed their advantage. Sherman tanks, coordinated and relentless, demonstrated the lesson of the battlefield. Speed, firepower, and armour often decided outcomes where courage alone could not. The Type 97 Chi-Ha, once celebrated as the pride of the Imperial Japanese Army, had been laid bare, its vulnerabilities exposed against the technological evolution and combined arms tactics of the Allied forces. The ghosts of steel lingered on Saipan, a stark reminder of war's unforgiving logic. Decades later, in 1965, the fields of Saipan had grown quiet, reclaimed by dense tropical vegetation and the relentless march of time. The scars of battle-twisted tank hulls, shell-cratered earth, and blackened bunkers remained as silent witnesses to the fury that had swept the island. Local historians, and the few surviving veterans, often pointed to the clearing where 31 Japanese Type 97 tanks had been destroyed in a single night, a grim testament to the cost of courage and miscalculation. Sergeant Hiroshi Tanaka, now an old man of 84, returned to the site, his steps slow but deliberate. He ran his hands over the jagged steel remnants of a Type 97, the metal cold, rough, and pitted by decades of sun and rain. "We fought with honour," he whispered, his voice trembling yet steady, the memory of fire, smoke, and the acrid scent of diesel still vivid. But the world had changed, and we could not stop it. For the Americans, Saipan had become a pivotal stepping stone toward the Japanese homeland, securing airfields that would project power across the Pacific. For the Japanese, the island was a brutal lesson in the unforgiving evolution of war, where bravery alone could not compensate for technological disparity and tactical misjudgment. 31 Type 97 seconds, destroyed in one night, became more than statistics. They were symbols of courage, hubris, and the relentless advance of armoured warfare. And the Shermans rolled on, steel titans carrying the momentum of a world at war toward its final chapters, leaving behind a legacy etched in flame, metal, and memory. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.